Okay, good morning. This is Jonathan Roberts, and we're going to spend about 45 minutes to an hour this morning talking about C.S. Lewis, which is actually, as many of you know, one of my favorite things to do. First, I want to start off by thanking Elizabeth Walker, who kicked this process off and thought that it might be a fun and engaging thing for families to read the Chronicles of Narnia during this most unusual period. So thank you to Elizabeth. I want to thank Jad Backlini, who runs communications for Epiphany, who is making all of this possible, and I know is really an unsung hero in pulling all this together and moving Epiphany online. And I want to thank my best friend Gar. It is his birthday today. And yeah, he's laughing because I remember about one out every 10 years. So I'm either a hero for remembering or a goat for forgetting. And as Gar knows, I'll assume the former. The first thing I'd like to address is sort of the fundamental question, which is why would we be thinking about C.S. Lewis now? Have I not been following current events and not aware that there's a massive virus pandemic going on and that it's actually a very scary time. For that, I'm going to turn to Lewis for inspiration. In 1939, in the midst of the Blitz and all right prior to the Blitz and all the concern with World War II that had just been going on, he gave a lecture at St. Mary's Church in Oxford. And sorry for the reaching, I'll be doing that a little bit. And he gave a sermon titled Learning in the Time of War. And this is what he wrote. If we let ourselves, we shall always be waiting for some distraction or other to end before we can really get down to our work. The only people who achieve much are those who want knowledge so badly that they seek it out while the conditions are still unfavorable. Favorable conditions never come. They are, of course, moments when the pressure of the excitement is so great that only superhuman self-control could resist it. They come both in war and peace. We must do the best we can. So perhaps the thought is, if Lewis could give that sermon in 1939 during a period of great stress, we too can seize the moment to further our own understanding of ourselves, great literature, and our spirituality. So with that, let me briefly outline how we'll proceed. I'm going to, basically from memory, do a biography of Lewis. I'll then survey his works. On this table all around the computer are about half of my collection, so just a ton of books. I'm going to show you just to kind of outline the scope of Lewis's work. We'll then go to some slides that I've prepared that will be pictures of Lewis, the kilns, where he did his work, pictures of the Inklings, etc., so you can get a feel of that. Then I'll spend a little bit of time on Narnia, because this is a kickoff to the Narnia series, and sort of give you a sense of what we'll cover in additional weeks, and then take questions. So Gar is manning the controls over there on the other side of this room, and so he'll have questions that we can respond to at the end. Those of you that know me know that I can talk about Lewis for a very long time, so we'll keep it to 45 minutes to an hour, and then wherever we are, we'll just end. So let's start off. C.S. Lewis. Clive Staple Lewis was born on November 29th, 1898, which essentially is basically the peak of the British Empire. Those of you may recall that it was Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897. So he really was born at an interesting time. He was born in Belfast, and mother and father. Mother was a lovely woman, Flora, and she was with the children. He has an older brother, Warren Lewis, who's 4 years older than him, and his father. Albert, as dad was a barrister, and they were, relatively well off. Has a grandfather that was in the church and was sort of loosely raised in the church, but not too actively, just a broader sense of family. The dad basically worked all the time. And there's a great quote of Albert. They would go to the beach on vacation, and Albert would come out in his full suit and pace the beach back and forth. And Warney later described his father as he had never seen someone so wedded to a dull routine. that was Albert, and so Lewis really was raised and connected to the mother. The boys had a wonderful imaginative life. They, were upstairs in the attic of their house. They would create all sorts of games and kingdoms. And I'll show you one thing. The first book that I'll reach across and maybe not find. Oh, here we are. So they created their own kingdom. And I don't even know, is this coming out okay, Garber? Yeah. And of course, everything Lewis wrote is now up just a little. Okay. Anyway, everything Lewis has wrote has now been published into a book. So these are the stories that Lewis and his brother wrote when he was like 9 and 10. And they created a whole animal kingdom up in their basement with animals that would work with each other and interact. And so, Lewis had an imagination. He is clear to say this is not a forerunner of the Chronicles of Narnia because it lacks the imagination and the mysticism of Narnia, but it is to show that Lewis was precocious. His life changed radically in 1908 when his mother caught a terminal illness and died. And those of you that have read the Chronicles of Narnia, I honestly think some of the most poignant things Lewis has written were in the beginning of The Magician's Nephew, where the young boy Diggory is his mother is ill, and Diggory is overwrought with what to do about that. Diggory is essentially C.S. Lewis. That was the moment of Lewis's great change. He wrote a letter that later said, I'm a boy whose mother died when he was 10. Everything else, that's the key event of my life. Everything else is secondary to that event. So Lewis was deeply affected by that. He referred to it in Surprised by Joy as being, marooned on an island, so just a completely desolate event in Lewis's life, and really the defining factor in Lewis's life. He then was able to stay at home for a couple of years. His brother Warney went off to boarding school, and Lewis occupied himself with books. His dad had a fabulous library, and Lewis became, exceedingly well-read within that library. His dad then sent him off to Warney's boarding school, and Lewis hated it. He absolutely hated boarding school. And if you read his autobiography entitled The Surprised by Joy, essentially how much he hated boarding school takes up like 3 chapters. And he gives World War I about a half chapter. So he really detested boarding school. And it was also during that period of time, there was a period of time where he was starting to get drawn into Christianity. There's this great quotation that he attended a church service and heard a minister talking about things that he, quote, actually seemed to believe. So Lewis is nothing if not a cynic. But it was also during that period of time that he later started to drift. He was influenced by essentially a house mother in one of his school arrangements, who was very mystical and seemed a little foo-foo to Lewis. And so he didn't find that very intellectually rigorous and started to drift. He talks about in Surprised by Joy being heavily influenced by this older boy named Pogo who was into fashion and style, and Lewis started to move away from belief and started to doubt the rigor of the faith. certainly began to feel it wasn't very cool. He then, after pleading with his father to get him out of the boarding school, his dad sent him to a private tutor. And this person is known as the Great Knock. And it's a tutor that his brother had gone to and basically had salvaged Warney's academic career and get him into essentially a school for military service. And it happened to have been Albert's tutor from when he was in college. So the Great Knock is really a primary influence of C.S. Lewis. He was a very intellectual, rigorously intellectual man, a crank. There's a fabulous anecdote where this is in The Surprise by Joy. Lewis gets in the car and he's been picked up at the train station. It's out kind of near Surrey, and they're driving, and Lewis looks out and says, you know, boy, the landscape here looks wild. And the Knock is like, what do you mean by wild? Is it wild in nature? Is it wild in variety? Is it wild in this? And Lewis has this quote that says, he had finally met an adult that had actually listened to him. And because he was just making a throwaway statement, and the Knock was attacking him for his use of the words, what he meant, what was behind it, how could he defend the position. And then Lewis says, you know, I finally thought it was over. And then he paused and he goes, never have I been so mistaken. So the entire drive was that. The Great Knock, if you want to get a sense of it, is essentially Professor Kirk in the Chronicles of Narnia. That is the Great Knock. I mean, people feel that character, who was a gruff, highly intelligent, cranky man, who became a believer, obviously, is what Lewis had wished for the Great Knock. But it was during that period of time that Lewis essentially lost his faith, because Knock was an atheist. Knock challenged him, and Lewis basically reasoned his way out of his childhood Christian belief. And so at that point, during that period of time, Lewis essentially became a confirmed atheist. So this is, 1915, 1916, in that era. There is a very interesting thing, though, that did happen to Lewis during that period of time. He was at the train station, and he found a book. Now I'm going to reach again. Sorry. This book by George MacDonald, Fantasies. I always mispronounce that. So just if you can read it and accept my pronunciation. So this is a book by George MacDonald, and Lewis was drawn by this story of Odonis, I think I'm mispronouncing that too, moving through this mystery land that he fell into while in the study, right? There's, echoes of the Tales of Narnia in this story. In fact, Lewis had said, that very little of what he's written hasn't been influenced by George MacDonald. And he credited with MacDonald for, quote, baptizing his imagination. So he was drawn to something. And he talks about this in Surprised by Joy. He's drawn by something that's essentially good, by something that's beautiful. He sees it in nature. He sees it in MacDonald's work. It's pulling on his imagination. And I think it's interesting to note that is sort of the first, real influence on Lewis, was the draw of an intuitive sense of the other, of something good. And this, for a highly intelligent, intellectually rigorous person, is interesting that was sort of the crack in his armor. So he's at the great. So we're somewhere around 1917 now. As you know, there's a war going on, and Lewis ends up getting accepted into Oxford. But it's interesting. He also signs up to be ready to go to the front. Now, his brother had already gone in, serving in the war, basically a quartermaster, and Lewis knew what this war was. I mean, there was no ambiguity that it was just a terrible, awful bloodbath in 1917. Lewis was an Irish citizen. Lewis did not have to serve. Lewis could have avoided being called up with the armed forces, but he did sign up. He had a very brief period of time at Oxford, and he was accepted into Oxford. And a small historical note, he would not have been accepted had it not been for the war, because Lewis could not pass the math test to get into Oxford. And because of the war, there was a waiver. So isn't that, I mean, let's all of us take great hope that you don't have to be great at math to be intellectual. Lewis is a fabulous example. In fact, he never really could balance his own checkbook. We could talk about that later. But anyway, he goes to Oxford and he meets up with 5 great friends, one of which is Patty Moore. And I'll show you a picture of Patty Moore and Lewis in a car. And this group is very, very close. And he also meets Patty Moore's mother, Mrs. Moore, and his kid sister, Maureen. And Patty and Lewis make an agreement that, that if either of them dies, the one will take care of the parent of the other. So Lewis of Mrs. Moore, who was divorced, and of course, Albert, Lewis's father, which not really a fair trade, because Albert was a successful barrister, had a brother Warney, and Mrs. Moore was relatively poor, and time will show needed a lot of care. So he then goes off to war in 1917, and he arrives at the front lines basically on his 19th birthday, November 29th. And he is in that war, and it is a completely awful thing. He gets trench fever and is convalescing for a period of time. And, you know, he actually ended up convalescing at a place where his dad could have visited him. And some of the saddest letters are his plaintive letters to his father asking him to come visit him, who he was somewhat estranged from. And his dad never came. And I think it's at that point, at least biographers suggest, that that's the point at which Lewis kind of shut off his relationship with his dad, that he was so hurt by that. He was also injured by a friendly shell, essentially a British shell that exploded, killed people around him. He was injured, and that ultimately led him being out of the front lines. All of the friends that he had at Oxford died, including Patty Moore. So he, it was just such a devastating thing. It was also during this period of time that he was reading, during this convalescing period, G.K. Chesterton. He had never been exposed to G.K. Chesterton, and Chesterton was, one of the 4 great men of letters during the early 1900s. You probably all know him as the author of the Father Brown series, which you can, watch on PBS. Chesterton also, I have a Chesterton book here somewhere. Oh, here it is. Here we go. Here's Chesterton. This is G.K. Chesterton, and he's just a fabulous character, and one of the most quotable people in the world is G.K. Chesterton. And Lewis says about Chesterton that he was essentially drawn to Chesterton by his, quote, essential goodness and intellectual rigor. And so Chesterton had written a book that Lewis was ultimately exposed to called The Everlasting Man. And that, basically was the mere Christianity of its day. And so Lewis began to be another crack. So what he credits MacDonald for, as we mentioned, was baptizing his imagination, and he credits Chesterton for baptizing his intellect. And those are the 2 primary literary influences on Lewis as he proceeds towards his Christian belief that ultimately occurs later on. So he goes back to Oxford, bounces around a little bit, completes his degree in English literature. He meets a very well-known person, J.R.R. Tolkien, who was there studying languages, and Tolkien, of course, we'll hear more about him, but they form a fast friendship, and Lewis is drawn towards Tolkien through their joint love of myth. They created a club that they called the Coal Biters Club, and what they meant by that is it was so cold in their rooms that they had to sit so close to the fire that they could bite the coal. And they each learned Icelandic so that they could read Nordic myths in the native tongue, because Icelandic, as you may or may not know, is the closest language to Old Norse that you can find. And so if you really want to go towards the original sources, you learn Icelandic, which I'm sure many of you have. In Lewis's case, it just happens to be like one of 11 languages that he speaks. So they read books that are kind of in this realm, right? Books like Beowulf and others. So they were steeped in ancient myth, both Greek, Nordic, Icelandic, English, Old English, and that was this group. That group over time morphed into what we've come to know as the Inklings. And so this is, of course, one of the great literary societies. Oh, Gar's laying all the books out. So this is, oh yeah, here we go. See, Gar's being helpful at every turn. Even though it's his birthday, he's still being such a good guy. So these are the key Inklings: Tolkien, Lewis, Owen Barfield. Owen Barfield was a barrister, and Lewis he called him his second friend. His first friend was Arthur Greaves. The first friend is someone that you share all the same, I'll keep this for just a second, and share all the same interest and love all the same things. Owen Barfield, he described as someone you read all the same books and disagree on everything. And so Owen Barfield was also a huge influence on Lewis's progress towards Christianity. He helped get rid of what Lewis called his historical snobbery. Lewis had this tendency to discount everything that had happened prior, that the only thing that mattered was what was in the current age. And Barfield was like, well, why are you doing that? Why are you discounting all of the rest of humanity up to this point and discounting it just because they happen to be dead? And so that started to broaden Lewis's awareness to all of the literature and all of the thinking that had happened prior to their present time, which, frankly, not unlike this time, was a highly secular time and critical time. So Barfield was a great friend. Barfield also, historical trivia note, his daughter was named Lucy. Lucy may be a term you're familiar with or a name you're familiar with. That was Lewis's goddaughter. And of course, we meet Lucy in the Chronicles of Narnia. So it's fun to think about that relationship, because Lewis didn't have children of his own. People would say, how in the world can you write children's books? You're like the least child-friendly person on the planet. And he's like, well, you discount the fact that I was a child once. And he knew Lucy. The other one is Charles Williams. These are sort of the literary Inklings. Actually, Tolkien's son participated, Christopher, who died just recently. And Warney was someone that came in and out of the Inklings. Dorothy Sayre was sort of a distant Inkling. So these friends would get together twice a week, once at a pub. I'll show you the name of that shortly. And at noon and have a pint, and they would get together, I think it was Thursday evenings in Lewis's rooms, and share and talk about literature. I mean, can you imagine? The reason there's books written about these guys is they're sitting around reading the first drafts of The Hobbit, of what Lewis wrote, and they tore each other apart. There's great anecdotes of like Lewis ripping into, or Tolkien. Lewis had this great statement about Tolkien, which is he would either take no feedback at all, or he'd take it and rewrite everything he had done, but he would never take modest feedback. And Tolkien credits Lewis for the Lord of the Rings. Can you imagine being lost writing the Lord of the Rings, inventing multiple languages, complete mythology, all of this history, doing it all, incidentally, without computers, without any, and Tolkien was just getting kind of lost in this world that he had created. And he credits Lewis for him completing the Lord of the Rings by virtue of, quote, sheer encouragement. Isn't that just beautiful? Sheer encouragement. So they have a vast, friendship amongst these characters. We could do a whole talk on the Inklings. In fact, I have, but we won't because I'm already going 25 minutes. So let's keep going. Quit delaying me out there with all your questions. Just joking. But there is such a great friendship between Lewis and Tolkien. It is a notable and historical, so to speak, literary friendship and deep friendship. So let's move through. So we're somewhere in the 1920s. In 1929, Lewis comes to the point where he believes that there is a God, and but he doesn't necessarily accept the divinity of Christ. He believes that there's a God, and in his book, Surprised by Joy, he calls himself the most reluctant convert in the world. And so and part of that was influenced by a historian at Oxford who was an atheist. I mean, pretty much everybody at Oxford was. It is kind of the intellectual thing to be, so to speak, unless you know 11 languages and Icelandic and all this sort of stuff. So, I mean, just never play defense on your belief, because the IQ is on the Christian side. Let me just note, or at least on belief. Just saying, I'm just being declarative on that. At least being a deist. I mean, geez. So you've got this shift in 29, and it was from this Oxford colleague who had basically said that he thinks the historical person of Jesus actually existed, and this kind of rocked Lewis's world. He also was noting in reading great literature, Milton and others, that there was this Wordsworth, all the great English writers, that there was this common defect that he calls that they all had, which is they were all Christians, that he was essentially a master pattern matcher and seeing these patterns of goodness, of evil, of trial, of redemption. And he couldn't avoid the fact that these people were operating within a Christian framework. And so this is 1929. We then continue these discussions. Now imagine the likes of Lewis, Barfield, Tolkien, Dyson, another member of the Inklings, arguing essentially 10 hours a week, often on myth and religion. And Lewis did this for 10 years with these guys. And so one of the things that makes Lewis such an effective apologist is the fact that he's believed in all the arguments that he then subsequently argues back against. He has held the other point of view. He has held it for a long time. He has tried to defend that point of view with the likes of a Tolkien, a Dyson, and a Barfield. And so that is the depth and the nuance that he has through this period of time. So the great conversion experience is described in Surprised by Joy. And it basically says that it's 1931, September 22nd. Incidentally, small trivia tip, September 22nd is Frodo Baggins' birthday. I know you're about to say, geez, who doesn't know that? But it's true. It is Frodo Baggins' birthday. And I have not read this anywhere, but I believe that is a nod from Tolkien to Lewis, given the significance of that day, that was the day he chose in The Lord of the Rings for the birthday. So that may or may not be true, but I'm just laying it out there, and now it's documented. So he, September 22nd, he is riding in the sidecar of a motorcycle with his brother Warnie, and they're driving to the Ipswich Zoo. And to directly quote from Surprised by Joy, "At the beginning of the ride, I did not believe in the the divinity of Christ. At the end of the ride, I did believe nothing happened during the ride. So it just dawned on him that it was true. And that after he believed it was true, he believed. And he has described it in Mere Christianity as sort of like waking up. When you wake up, there's a point in time when you're asleep and there's a point in time when you're awake, and you're not entirely sure when you woke up. You're just aware that you woke up. And so that was sort of his, if you will, conversion experience in the sidecar driving to the Ipswich Zoo. And what he said was that the talk with Dyson and Tolkien had a lot to do with it. And they were walking on Addison Walk in Oxford. You can go and visit it, and it's just beautiful walk. And you're looking at these great, Oxford buildings, and Lewis's office is up on the second floor on the corner there. And they had walked till like 2 a.m. talking. And the thing that clicked for Lewis is Tolkien had said, Lewis, we both love myth. We both believe in the power of myth. Christianity is true myth. It operates in the same way as myth, but it's true. And so Lewis, who had essentially, since he climbed up on the, when he was visiting Arthur Greeves when he was, 12 years old, and loving myth, had believed and understood the power of myth. And that true myth is what clicked for Lewis. And he became a Christian in 1931. Let me see, what else to mention about Lewis during that period of time? I should note, and it's quite famous, that Lewis never was given a tenured position, a full professor position at Oxford. He was always a tutor. And that meant that, frankly, he earned about 1/3 less money than a full professor. Tolkien was like one of the youngest professors ever granted at Oxford. Oxford denied him that position 2 or 3 times. It's a committee of 5. And as he became an apologist, a notable Christian apologist, noting that that's not intellectual, can't be like C.S. Lewis, I mean, hey, so therefore you can't give this guy a tenured position. And he, challenged people. So he was not a well-liked person per se in the academic community at Oxford, and was denied multiple times, with the likes of Tolkien putting him up for the professorship. So that took a lot of arrogance. It's something that Oxford, I mean, there's literally books written about his denial of tenure at Oxford. He ultimately was offered a position at Cambridge that Tolkien helped facilitate. There's a great, and this is in the early 50s, he had turned it down, Lewis did. Tolkien, engaged with Lewis and said, boy, you really have got to take this. Someone else had taken the position. When they heard that Lewis was interested in it again, they declined. It was a woman professor, and obviously a gracious and loving thing for her to do. And he took that position, and then Oxford, quickly realizing that they're going to be known as complete idiots for the rest of time, scrambled and offered him a professorship, but he didn't take it. But let me note, other than, we can trash Oxford for a few more minutes, and I'm fired up to do that, but let's just move on. Think about Lewis in a small room with one-on-one tutor working through their work and describing and commenting and back and forth every week. There's an immediacy to Lewis. There's an accessibility to Lewis. There's speaking in the common voice. And that comes from the fact that he had to work hard. He was engaged directly with students. That I think is part of the voice that we have from Lewis. It is so powerful. Boy, I'm going, Gar, now we've gone on for over a half hour. You're not running a very good railroad. You're not doing a very good railroad here. So Lewis becomes a converted Christian. We move up through the 30s. He starts doing some writing here and there. I won't go through all of the books he's written in the order, because that will take a long time. But the next key point we come to, of course, is World War II. And he was approached by the British broadcasting system to start doing what became known as the broadcast talks. And it was the feeling that the morale of the troops and the country needed to be raised during that period of extreme trial. So Lewis went from Oxford down to London to give these broadcast talks. And these broadcast talks, something like 600,000 people were listening to him. I tried to do the math on what kind of impact that is. And best I can come up with, it's sort of the equivalent of the number of people that watched the Final Four. It was a big deal. And in one of his biographies, they say, hey, listen, turn up the radio, that bloke's talking. And that bloke, of course, was Lewis. So imagine, Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chat. So imagine people listening around a radio in a pub, listening to C.S. Lewis give what essentially became Mere Christianity. And that is what sort of radically increased Lewis's profile. So I'm going to reach for another set. Oh, there they are. Would you hand those to me? No, the 3 books. All those. Yeah. Thank you. So these books come out and people give these, give me copies. So, The Case for Christianity, this is an early version. Christian Behavior, this is an early version. And then that all became Mere Christianity in later publications. So this had a profound impact, and it put Lewis on the map as a Christian apologist. As noted, did not help his tenure at Microsoft. Oops, sorry, Freudian slip. We can talk about Microsoft too for a long time. Sorry about that. The next big hit from Lewis, would you hand me the screw tape letters, both of those? Okay, the next big hit around 1942 was the screw tape letters. Now I want to show you a deeply loved book. This is my original copy of the screw tape letters, eaten by our late dog Bean. Love that dog, but really trashed this book. This is a better book. This is an annotated version of the screw tape letters. And of course, this is the dialogue between a senior devil and a junior devil, screw tape to wormwood, talking about how to influence a patient. And this is what sort of exploded Lewis's awareness, or people's awareness of C.S. Lewis as a Christian apologist in the early 1940s. I'll show you, if I get to it, if Gar didn't let me go on so long, we'll get to that in the slides. So we then have Lewis as an apologist. He spends a lot of the late 30s and 40s as a Christian apologist, writing Mere Christianity, Abolition of Man, multiple articles, the screw tape letters. He then starts turning sort of in the late 40s to children's literature, and we get, of course, the wonderful, Chronicles of Narnia. And earlier than that, he had done some adult science fiction, Prelandria, and see, Gar, now I've moved the screen. Well, anyway, I won't go. We're gonna just keep moving. He had done science fiction. So Lewis, through the course of the time, one of the great things about Lewis is he's done nonfiction, Christian apologist. He's done satire, screw tape letters. He's done adult science fiction, Prelandria, and the space trilogy that he did, which is just fabulous. We could talk a lot about that. He does the Chronicle of Narnia. So the range of what he's doing is just so impressive. He is also, the main thing he did, he wrote the Oxford History of English Literature. This is, he calls this, look at how thick this book is, right? He read every book of 16th century literature in the Oxford Library. I've seen that library. I mean, it is just kind of an unimaginable thing to have done. And he considered this the main course. He actually, all this other writing, C.S. Lewis calls garnish. This was the main meal. This is what Lewis was truly working on. And so just imagine writing the definitive guide to English language in the 16th century and being denied tenure at Oxford. Take that one more time. Done with those guys. So Lewis becomes a very well-known author and is popular. he starts getting all sorts of communication with people. So there are dozens of books written on Lewis's letters, because he would respond to letters at night. He never typed. He had a little bit of rheumatism in the hands, and so this was painful for him. But letters to children, all the letters, people save his letters. He responded to children. I'll read a couple of those things out of there if Gar hadn't let me go so long. Letters to an American lady, a correspondence he had over 20 years with a woman who was frankly kind of a wacko hypochondriac. Letters of mercy after his wife, Joy, died with another person who was suffering. And then if you really want to go hardcore, his collected set of letters. So Lewis was an active correspondent. We kick up into the 50s. He meets his future wife, Joy Davidman, through a correspondence. They fall in love mostly through intellectual engagement. She was a fierce intellect. They end up, she moves to the UK. There's books written on their relationship too. And she falls in love with Lewis. Lewis is a little slow on the uptake. She had dabbled with communism in the US. Of course, this is the crazy McCarthy era. She was about to be kicked out of England. Lewis marries her in sort of just a formal, a legal marriage so she could stay with her two sons, Douglas and David, because their father was kind of a crazy alcoholic bad guy back in Texas. And Joy takes over, moves into the kilns that Lewis owned with Warney and Mrs. Moore. I forgot to mention Mrs. Moore. He's been taking care of Mrs. Moore for all of her life, and she became a very cranky and difficult person, and part of the reason that in Lewis's writing he gives such a hard time to women. Sorry, it's true. And Mrs. Moore is part of that reason, people speculate. So he marries Joy. It's not an intimate, it's a marriage for legal reasons. Joy then gets cancer, and she becomes very, very ill, and Lewis cares for her, and she is in the hospital. I'm trying to remember the date of when that happened, but it is in the mid 50s, and he 1956, marries Joy Davidson at the Oxford Registry Office. She is dying. They go in 1957 to the hospital. They call in an Episcopal priest, Professor Bide, the priest Bide, and Lewis asks to be married within the church. And so he marries them right then and there. And that actually put him in great peril because it wasn't an approved thing. And Bide kind of wrote that he sort of resented being put on the spot like that. But he did do a Christian marriage of Joy and Lewis. He also laid hands on Joy and prayed. And Lewis believes that she had benefited from faith healing, and he feels that there was some transference to him, and he took on some of her pain. They then had a fabulous marriage, living at the kilns. Mrs. Moore had died a few years earlier, so they had that to themselves with Warney, and it's just a beautiful relationship that those two had for a number of years. And it was after that relationship, or during that relationship, that he wrote The Four Loves, which is just an incredible book that he could not have written, I think, had he not had that relationship with Joy, because the intimacy of it, the nature of it, the passion of it. She then dies in 1960, and Lewis writes A Grief Observed, and a number of other letters that add, incredible insight and warmth and depth that I think was new to his experience. So a wonderful relationship with Joy. At this point, he's up at Cambridge, having received the position up there. He ultimately falls into poor health. It always had sort of a poor heart and other issues. And C.S. Lewis dies in 1963 on November 22nd, which I'm sure you all remember that as the death of John F. Kennedy. So the C.S. Lewis and JFK died on the same day. Along the way, he had someone visit him. Warney was a binge drinker and alcoholic and would sort of disappear. And Lewis had this incredible workload. So he took on basically an intern, a man named Walter Hooper, who was with him for like 3 months, had gone back to, I think it was to Connecticut College. I can't remember. No, Kentucky. In any case, Hooper was with him and ultimately became the steward of his literary legacy under the direction of Douglas Grisham, who was Douglas and David were the survivors of Joy and Lewis through adoption. And it's really because of Walter Hooper that we have all this incredible collection of Lewis's writing, because he became a Catholic priest, but such an amazing steward of the Lewis literary legacy, Walter Hooper. And I have a book written by Hooper. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So, and he wrote a Lewis biography and was the steward of his papers. Actually, I don't think this is very good, but some of his writing is really brilliant about Lewis. So that is C.S. Lewis. And now, since Gar's let me go so long on this, and I just knew he would.
So I think Jed just put out there, we're moving to Q&A. Any questions, please share them. While people are typing, I can either ask you one of the questions or we can quickly go through slides while people are typing.
Let's quickly go through slides.
Okay. And then as questions come up, I will.
Yeah, and then you know what? I'm going to go through these slides and just describe the slides. And so we'll just click through it because I promised him. So this is Lewis as a kid. He's the one, the younger one. That's Warney, his brother. That's the earliest photo of Lewis that you see there. And of course, the stories that he wrote as a kid. So let's go to the next one, Gar.
So the first question coming up, by the way, is how did Jonathan become so interested in C.S. Lewis from Marianne?
Oh, well, let me click through all the slides. Okay. I can't multitask. I'll do the slides, and that's a great question from Marianne, and I'll get back to that. An annoying atheist in a foxhole. Lewis, this is one small point. He never converted to Christianity. And so he, during World War II, he was an atheist in the foxhole. And that is Patty Moore sitting next to him in that car. So the person who he then took over, Mrs. Moore. One of the great things, this is just a stack of his books. I've showed you a bunch of these already. He was an unapologetic Christian. And I think he's still considered perhaps the most effective Christian apologist of the 20th century. And he never plays defense. He only plays offense. You got to love that about Lewis. Next, Gar. So here is just a montage of his friends. You can see Tolkien, the first few pictures in what I'm seeing is the upper right. Owen Barfield is next to Tolkien in the upper part. Charles Williams is lower right in my side. And then you have pictures of Lewis there. And just incredible, fabulous friendship of those guys. Next, Gar. So that's the pub, the Eagle and the Child. And you can go there. There's actually a little plaque of Lewis, where the Inklings, this is, where the Inklings met every week to have a pint. And that is the church. Lewis was a big believer in going to your local parish. So that is the church that Lewis went to and where he is buried. Next. More on the friendship. That's a picture of Joy sitting at the kilns with Lewis. They stand together. That's Arthur Greaves and C.S. Lewis, Tolkien and Lewis. The gentleman with the pipe, that's his brother Warney. Okay, next, Gar. Just a note, not a Facebook friend. I thought this was kind of fun. That is the pew that Lewis and Warney sat in. You'll notice that it's narrow and it's right by a post. They took that so that no one would sit next to them. So Lewis, he's kind of a strange guy. Go on, Gar. So this is, Lewis was on the front page of Time magazine, and this was after the Screw Tape letters. That's also the other article is Toynbee. He is Arnold Toynbee, who was a historian that could explain all history through intellectual examination of the past. I'm simply noting that we're talking about C.S. Lewis. We're not talking about Toynbee because he was incredibly wrong, inaccurate, predicted nothing, and is now a footnote in history. And we're still reading Lewis. So take that. Let's go. So now the Narnian, that is Lewis in the old coat that was his dad's. He wore that coat till it basically fell off of him. Those are, and that's also a coat that actually, that might not be his dad's coat. That might just be the English Dawn coat that they wore around Oxford. But that is our friend, C.S. Lewis. So now let's take questions, Gar. We'll go for a few minutes.
First one back to how did you become so interested in Marianne in C.S. Lewis?
Okay. And do we want to go back to video or keep on the slide?
You're still on video, man.
I was on video the whole time.
Yeah.
Oh, this is crazy.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jad. Boy, you're a master at these things. So I became interested. I did read or had read to me the Narnia when I was a kid, but I'll be honest, it was 30 years ago listening to lectures by Earl Palmer. And is really a foremost expert on Lewis. And so he gave these lectures. I then went to, we started to attend Epiphany and was part of this adult education group that Dwight had called together. And I strongly encouraged the church to do a C.S. Lewis series. And in classic Dwight fashion, he asked me to do it. And so I decided I better study up on this stuff. And that was 9 years ago. And so I've been leading a weekly discussion group on C.S. Lewis for 9 years. So I think at this point, I consider myself an official enthusiast of C.S. Lewis. I would also note, just a plug for Lewis and why to read a lot of Lewis. Owen Barfield referred to Lewis he called it the centrality of his thought. So Lewis had a handful of key themes, good and evil. Boy, the screw tape letters on evil. The centrality of Christ, personal struggle, and these and the importance of choice. These themes that Lewis has, he works through all of his works. So when Barfield says the centrality of his thought, you can go from Lewis and say, here's how he deals with it in the science fiction series, in Narnia, in Mere Christianity, and Surprised by Joy, and Letters to Malcolm Chiefly on Prayer. And it all hangs together. And so my interest in Lewis is deepened through this minion, which has honestly been a real blessing for me to be able to spend so much time with him. And I was going through a bunch of stuff this morning, as you might imagine. And I kept thinking like, oh man, I forgot about that. I wish we'd covered that last week when we were, doing our discussions. So next question, Gar.
Okay, so Valerie is asking, was he a professor at Oxford? Literature, philosophy, or religion? What was he teaching his students?
Literature.
Literature?
Yeah, history of, he, wrote the history of Oxford history of English literature. He also had done a great deal of philosophy, but he was literature. Yeah.
Okay. And then where does the term Inklings come from?
Wow, you're not supposed to ask me questions I can't remember. We didn't screen these. What are you doing? Oh, just like her to do that. The Inklings, actually, now that I'm going back in my memory bank, Inkling was a term that was founded by an undergraduate group that the older group then adopted. So it came from somewhere else that they then accepted as their own. I don't know what the origin of the word inkling is. I'm sure it's actually deeply meaningful because Lewis and Tolkien and those guys were not casual. So I'll take that as a lookup item.
And actually with that, we are out of time.
We're out of time.
We're ending up. Okay,
so can I say thank you?
Yeah.
Oh, I can. Okay.
Yeah,
I just don't. I didn't know. I mean, I just see Jad back there with the pluggies. So I want to thank everybody for spending this time with me on C.S. Lewis. It's obviously something I really love. I would encourage you to read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe this week. And I mentioned at the beginning that Elizabeth Walker is putting together a series. I think there may be recordings of people reading it that you can download, but read it with your kids. And then next week, we'll jump in. I can say that I'll be brief, but evidence suggests that may or may not be the case. I will try to be brief, and I will talk just about, and so let me show you something here. People love Narnia. So we've got books like this on where did he come up with Narnia and what is all the symbolism of Narnia. There's, philosophies, stick them right in front of the title, philosophies of Narnia, Planet Narnia. There is a lot of stuff on Narnia. So we really look forward to your feedback. Please email it to us, but the feeling on the cadence of this will be, I'll do an overview of the book. In this case, please read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe this week. I'll do an overview of in this case, I'll do a review of what you will have read, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and an overview of the next book, Prince Caspian, and have general discussion on Narnia, and do a much better job of responding to questions. So please, everyone, keep safe, keep healthy, and hopefully read a little C.S. Lewis this week. So thank you very much. Thank you for spending the time with us. Bye-bye.
Perfect. All right.